Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to the Film Realist Podcast, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody that is hopefully for somebody. I believe this is episode 82, and it is a jam-packed episode, and for most of it, we are going to be joined by special returning guest, friend of the show, of Screenrant and all sorts of everybody's favorite movie websites, Rob Keys.
I'm here, 82 episodes. That's such a monumental number compared to where I'm at with our podcast. We're like in the 40s still.
I mean, it's much easier when I'm scheduling just me, so.
Yeah, you're very consistent, I'll say that. You generally are on a weekly schedule, which is very nice. And back in the day, 10 years ago, we used to do a weekly thing as well. So I miss those days.
I do too. I remember the very first episode of Screenrant I listened to, and it was the Lex Luthor casting episode.
Oh, when it happened during the recording?
Yeah.
That's a special episode. Yeah.
It is. It's a very good one. And then for a long time, that's pretty much where I would see the movie just because you guys were going to review it. And I remember famously, there was one episode where I was like, a friend of mine was visiting and he's like, what do you want to do? I'm like, well, I need to see this. And he's like, do we need to go see Dracula Untold? I'm like, yeah, it has to be what Screen Rant Underground is reviewing. And then you guys didn't review it.
Oh, I'm shocked because I think we did a set visit for that film. I sent Ben to Ireland.
I think so.
Ben, by the way, for those listening, Ben Kendrick, who still co-hosts podcast X with me and helped me run Screenrant for many years and hosted the Screenrant Underground podcast we're talking about. I regretfully sent him to Ireland for this movie because I wanted to go to Ireland for that movie. I had overlap with schedules. But I actually love that movie in a weird way, and I wanted to see
It's
a
a
sequel.
lot of fun.
Yeah. I like
it does everything I wish the Mummy did of the 2017 Mummy.
The Tom Cruise Mummy, yes.
Yes. All right. So Rob is going to be here for 2/3 of the show because he is a very busy man. So I was very fortunate that he was scheduling out some time. So this week's episode is going to be unlike most, which is if you're a longtime listener of the show, you know that if we're covering TV, it's always full spoilers. So today's TV is going to be for X-Men 97. And then we're going to be covering the streaming release of Roadhouse. Again, full spoilers for that, so we can maximize what we can talk about and giving us more time to talk about said things. And then for the last third of the show, I'm going to do a just full-blown spoiler review of Ghostbusters. I keep wanting to call it Afterlife, but Frozen Empire. So that's what you can look forward to on today's episode of the podcast. And then as per usual, the outros and whatnot. And questioner mail. Or question of the week, not question or mail. They're the same thing. It doesn't matter. So time codes will be listed in the description if you want to jump around. So without further ado, let's get into X-Men 97. Did that clip play for you? No. Okay, so it played it for the recording. Oh, it didn't. It's live. That's why. Let's try that again.
We get this done by working together as a team.
Jeez, Bob. Keep buzzing in my ear.
Did that one work?
Yes, I heard that.
Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to have to edit out some dead silence, but that's fine. All right. The triumphant return of X-Men, the animated series. I know your favorite animated series, I think, of all time.
Correct.
And this was a big deal. So it's going to be an interesting conversation because I know that you've seen 3. Me being a consumer has only seen 2, which is interesting. But given the run of only, 8 or 10? 10 episodes
I believe.
We're getting so
yeah.
far. Yeah, 10. So this is going to be, I feel like, an interesting conversation. It's very rare that you and I think have differing opinions succinctly on something, which is obviously X-Men the Animated Series is one of the tent poles, founding fathers of, I would argue, modern superhero animated television that goes along with Batman the Animated Series, Spider-Man to some degree. I hold Batman on a higher regard than X-Men, but that's partially because of consistency with creative crew. If you're following X-Men the Animated Series' production history and know anything about Haim Saban, you know how difficult he is to work with. Yeah. And unfortunately, you can kind of see that throughout X-Men. And getting into X-Men 97, I was a little nervous because although I thought the character models for the characters in the show, that being what they look like not in motion, were fantastic and good modernizations of the characters we knew from the 90s series, I was concerned what they were going to look like in motion because this seems to be a trend with North American animation projects where characters look really good when they're standing still and then their full motion is not necessarily great. And I kind of still feel that way. However, what still stands the test of time and worked so well for me was the performances and the writing for the show, which is doing exactly what the show did in the 90s. So I really did enjoy it. How do you feel returning to this world, Rob?
Yeah. So we just talked about this on our podcast. What is Podcast X? And for me, yes, to double down on what you said, X-Men animated series was my number one. Partly because, and I will say this, in comparing to Batman the animated series, to me they're both like perfect shows. Like these are the 1 and 2 shows. Like, and to me they both still hold up. Now I think Batman certainly is a more polished and consistent product for the reasons you say. I mean, you can go back, like you said, to production history, and not to get bogged down in this, but certainly the first season, I think they had a 7-month run and only a couple of weeks just to get working on it, and they had like. They're using a South Korean animation studio. The production headquarters was in LA. They were doing voice work in Canada and Toronto or something. And this is like the beginning of this was 32 years ago. So literally shipping tapes from country to back and forth. And they made that happen. So it's, but at the same time, if you compare, and this is a weird comparison to make, but you compare like the first season or 2 or 3 of each show, there's a larger variety of assets and characters required into different varied environments. It's not like this is in Gotham and you have Batman and Alfred and X. You know what I mean? That's kind of a nonsensical comparison because Batman does so many things as well and so many different characters and stories. But I think they're trying to do more different things, and it's an ensemble piece very intentionally, not just for the episodic baddies, but it's the heroes and the villains are very ensemble like. It's just the nature of the beast. So I think it's a little bit more complicated. That being said, both shows are incredible, and they're both ahead of their time, I think. But yes, to skip forward to now, I couldn't be more enthused and like amazed that under these circumstances, under like ownership changes, under Disney, under a streaming service, somehow these people. It feels very reminiscent of when Marvel Studios began the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It was like a ragtag team, people who loved a thing, and they came from a guy, Kevin Feige, who worked for the Donner Company and worked on X-Men as an assistant. You know what I mean? He was there at the beginning. He was a fan. He was the guy that went to Kevin Feige was the guy that went into the room and made sure, like, we got to do the Wolverine hair because fans need the hair. You know what I mean? And you skip forward to now, and when they're making the show and they're pitching it for the streaming service. And maybe we have to thank Disney's weird rush to catch up with Netflix and get in on the streaming game for greenlighting this in the first place. But Kevin Feige said, look, if you're going to do the X-Men animated series, hells yeah. But you need the music and you need the cast. And they did. They brought back a lot of the cast members. For the most part, in a great way. Cal Dodd is back as Logan. He sounds just like Wolverine. Like, you can almost can't even tell the difference, which is incredible. However, you listen to the voice of Rogue, and it doesn't quite fit. It's okay, but it just doesn't quite fit. It's not a big knock against the show, though. I know what you're saying about the animation, but when you compare it to kind of like the choppy animation, and especially when it comes to the action scenes and movement, it kind of, in a weird way, meshes with that and modernizes it the same way the whole visual aesthetic is so much more polished and cleaner and a higher frame rate. And of course, it's HD and widescreen now, so you combine that with like a really amazing score by the Newton Brothers, who had their own sort of mix on the theme song. Yes, they brought back the theme song. That was essential. That is the show. Most iconic theme song in television for me. I really, really enjoy it. I love how they're going forward with it literally set in 97. It is literally a season 6 of the original show. And I love how they respect that. And I love how they're throwing so many they're teasing. And it is a 10-episode run, but if you go back to the original show, I think 3 of the seasons were only 10 or 13 episodes anyway, so it is in line with that. But they're setting up so many different arcs and pulling from the comics in so many different ways. In the first 3 episodes alone, that I'm very excited that they had greenlit 2 seasons from the get-go, because you need at least that to explore like half of these, right? So I'm hoping this show is here to stay, and this is not a 2-year, 3-year thing. I want this show just to keep going, because they have 30, 40 years of comics to pull from now, plus whatever is made in the coming years. So this is a show I think should just be a staple. I think every year or two, we should see the continuation from the 90s up to the early aughts up till now. I think this show should last forever if they can maintain this quality. And before I hand it off to you, the big question mark there is the showrunner and co-creator of the show, Bo DeMaio, was mysteriously let go and fired like days before the show aired, or a week before the show aired, the day before the premiere, and 2 days before we were going to do like a giant interview with him. So no one knows what happened there, but this person did already write and set up the first 2 seasons. So very strange situation.
That is ironic that it did happen, and obviously with full details for that. I know Screenrant, of course, was covering the unplanned departure of the showrunner.
Yep.
But if you look at, I know Ben's been talking about it recently, Daredevil is a good example. That was developed with somebody else, and then it was Drew Goddard, and then moved on to Steven DeKnight and whatnot. So fingers crossed. I think maintaining the quality ultimately for me is the biggest mainstay of why I hold X-Men, the original animated series, in high regard, and it's something you brought up, and it's a great thing to talk about that differs so much from the animated series, which was scope. And covering these stories with such a serious nature, and it's ironic and unfortunately sad at the same time how modern these stories still hold up, and the statement of prejudice in the mid-90s and carrying that forward now into the extreme nature that these acts are actually happening in the real world and the resonance that it's going to have. I watched the first one with Melody, and she was kind of like overwhelmed by everything. It was like, is there more of this? I'm like, yeah, well, there's about five seasons. She's like, can we watch them? I'm like, I might have to rewatch these, kiddo, before I let you see what was happening.
Can I jump in there? So I
absolutely, go ahead.
Let my daughter kind of watch the first 2-part. Well, I forget what it's called, Night of the Sentinels or something. The original 2-part premiere.
Yeah, Night of the Sentinels. Yeah,
and she blew her mind. She loved it. She's like, Dad, this is my favorite show, and I was so proud. Everything in life just came to that pinnacle moment. And then one day she woke up early, started watching an episode, and I was falling asleep in bed. And then for Friday night movie night, she's like, Dad, I want to watch X-Men. I'm like, yes, this is my
You're
daughter.
off the Paw Patrol wagon.
And then my wife though is like, no, I don't think she should be watching this. And I'm like, look. Common Sense Media says 7. The recommendation for parents, and it's 7. She's fine. And she's like, no. And I'm like, oh, I can't have this battle right now. So my daughter and I had to stop watching it. And we started watching Super Kitties or something on Netflix. So
my kids just started watching that too.
So I'm like, oh no. Oh. So I told my daughter, I'm like, don't worry. Very near future, we're going to get back to the show. She's so excited. She loves the characters. And I'm like, oh man, I'm so proud. But yeah, it is. Look, I get it. I mean, right away there's people dying, and there's no like sex and drugs, and the weapons fire is lasers, so it's like, and she loves it. She wasn't scared by any of the craziness of the Sentinels attacking and stuff. So, I do hope it's a great way to learn, because I felt. Look, there's no secret. When Giant Size X-Men came out way back in the day and switched up the team, it became like diversity was a thing. It was just the norm. We just accept each other. We are from different countries, and very intentionally from different countries. One of your most heroic and badass characters ever is Storm from Africa, who's this goddess, and you see her lose her powers in the returning episodes, which is nuts and sad. And even though it's only episode 2, it's deeply emotional, especially in how Magneto reacts to that, right? So like that was just normalized, people being different. And then, of course, the meta main layer, it's like, yeah, people were born different. These people are special in their own way, and there's so much prejudice. You look at these Friends of Humanity, and it's like so... It feels on the nose, but it's so ahead of its time, because they were doing this 30, 40 years ago in the comics and the cartoons, and now this is very applicable to present-day geopolitics. And it's horrifying, but also a great way to teach our youth to accept each other. We work together, and you present that in this framework that has Magneto's psyche versus the goals of Professor Xavier, and how they're both kind of approaching a similar issue in very extreme different ways. And it was a very subversive way to kind of teach us as young to like accept and understand this thing. I think we're all better for it. So X-Men was always ahead of its time for that, and I hope this show continues that. It seems to be doing that in its first episodes. But yeah, this isn't just a show where superheroes fight villains. It was always so much more about that. By the way, not to keep on this tangent, but you go watch the original series, in the first couple episodes, a female president. First time in like animation, I think, on North American TV that we had a female president. So I'm like, yeah, awesome, right? So a little thing like that, which seems like just a throwaway scene on a TV. It's like, no. They were so ahead of the game without throwing it at your face. You know what I mean? So I love everything about this show.
Something that I appreciate so much about the way that the storytelling was handled in the original series, specifically, it's ironic given the inconsistent production in quality of the 20th Century Fox X-Men movies and handling stories that we all growing up watching the original series were just do that. Oh, Phoenix Saga? Can you no? Okay. Age of Apocalypse?
I know.
Days of Future Past maybe being the only one that I would say is probably on similar levels in terms of developing that story.
Yeah, but could have been better. The goofiness of the future Sentinels, how they handle some of the future mutants, the complete waste of Bishop. Like, so there were dumb things in there. But yeah, you're right. The blueprint was there for all of these major stories, and all they had to do was just accept it, right? So, well.
Well, and that message, I think this is something that it's a conversation I have a lot, and we're both fathers, so I think it's an interesting discussion, which is like our kids, we know what they consume, hopefully, because we're not in charge. We're responsible for what they absorb, whether it be age appropriate or not, depending on maturity level. That's a whole different conversation. But in terms of, there's been a couple movies I've taken to her more recently, that being Trolls Band Together, and then I took Sawyer to see Kung Fu Panda 4, which is easily the worst of the Kung Fu Pandas.
Aww.
But it's not good. But delivering managing to make this so cohesive, and I talked about Melody watching it, and this just for me just shows, obviously that we've already mentioned the showrunner being pushed off the show, but the simplicity in the message and it being, I asked Melody why are those people mad at the X-Men? And I said, well, because they're born different. Is that okay? She's like, no, you should accept people. Everybody is different.
There you go.
It's like, yeah, you're 6. Thank you. Like, keep thinking that. That's the important part. Please don't get off that train. But handling these stories with a mature lens, but not dumbing it down to kids, has always been such a tightrope walk for most. I'm just not throwing it just over into kids media, but family-friendly media in general. Because I remember watching this with my dad, watching Batman the Animated Series moving forward. And that's a really important thing, because when it feels like an educational lesson as opposed to part of the story that the characters are learning that message, at least in my experience, it was substantially more digestible. And there's a lot of really interesting things teed up in these first 2 episodes. The bringing the child into the world, and that conversation that Jean has with Storm about Nathan being born human. And we know he's probably not, given who Cable is, but that's maybe going to get addressed later. And then also the ramifications of Storm losing her powers. I don't know about you, but I immediately went to, please don't do whatever X-Men The Last Stand did with this. Yeah.
No, I was going to say on the Storm thing, I'm surprised they pulled that card, because it was in the middle of multiple other story arcs, and then in the following episodes they set up even more major arcs and crossovers from the show. But that Storm stuff's from the 80s comics or 70s comics or something, which I was very, very surprised by. To your point about, maybe I shouldn't say that. Continue. I'll circle back on that.
Okay. But
Don't want to get ahead.
It's been an ongoing conversation about the presentation of these characters, and I've seen it a lot online. Don't get me wrong, I love Wolverine. I think he's the biggest. No, he's not even the biggest face on my t-shirt. Thanks, Old Navy. But in terms of showing the variety of the characters and the multiculturalness in the characters, me being somebody who's biracial, dad born from Hong Kong, there were so few people that I saw that ever looked like me on TV. It's why Crazy Rich Asians was a big deal. And then moving on to Shang-Chi, and then fingers crossed if we do bring in other characters from the Marvel Comics, specifically new Iron Fist, because they don't want to bring back Finn Jones. Anyways, but having that presentation and continuing to move that forward was something I really appreciated. And each of these characters being adults are having adult conversations. Now, as you said, they're not clearly Cyclops and Jean had sex. There's a baby, but they're not addressing that. I mean, Goofy had a baby, but we don't know who Max's mom is. But in terms of all the dynamics changing, and they haven't frozen these characters in amber, outside of the fact that, yes, this is supposed to be 1997. Well, specifically, I think technically it would be 98, but that doesn't actually matter. 97 sounds better. It's why the Superman comic is 78 and the Batman comic is 89, as opposed to taking off from their sequels, which are quite good. I'm really enjoying those movie continuations. And for me, what I found most impressive was the portrayal of Magneto as somebody who lost his best friend. And again, obviously these things have happened. We've both read comics where Charles is dead. He's gone to the future. He comes, it's X-Men. It's probably the most sci-fi of the main, maybe Fantastic Four. now that I've said that. But in terms of like the scope of what they do say and what they do tell you about, I mean, Charles, in my mind, is probably going to be coming back. Why would he be in the intro otherwise? And then the one thing I wanted to talk about, which I found quite comical, that it's played up as a surprise, and we're in full spoilers, so if you didn't watch, you're going to be spoiled. Somebody showing up looking like Jean at the very end, and them all being like, oh my god! I'm like, you just spent 5 years fighting somebody named Mystique.
Yeah.
True. Why is this surprising?
Also, Morph's on your team. You can do the same thing.
Also, exactly, yeah. Morph. Well, and then that's something it's ironic. I was talking to Delina about that over the breakfast table this morning because she came back from nights. She's like, what did you think? I was like, explaining some of the changes. Like, they added Bishop. He got a haircut. No more mullet. Some things don't last from the 90s, I guess. Saying Not did. I really like the Cyclops stuff, and we can talk about that in a minute. But making Morph non-binary, I mentioned it. She goes, well, duh. Like a character who would be fluid like that, of course.
It makes, Morph's actually a well-handled character so far, and I love, and I've always appreciated the relationship between Morph and Wolverine, too, so you get a little bit more of that, too. Yes, I can't wait to talk to you after episode 3, which capitalizes on that moment you're talking about, because...
Why isn't this show coming out on Saturday mornings? Why Wednesdays? What is Disney doing?
And it's also coming out at midnight, right? It's dropping at midnight PST, so...
Is it midnight PST? It's not even not... Oh, that's annoying.
Yeah, I think it's 3 a.m. for us, right? Yeah. I asked them. I confirmed that when we were covering like when the episodes drop. Yeah, which is weird. That's the old Disney model. We thought they moved away from. They should be dropping primetime weekday, or the real creative solution is like this should be dropping at Saturday mornings at 6 a.m. or something. You know what I mean? So
that'd be amazing.
I mean, they sent me a cereal box in the mail for the show. Like they know
I saw that. That was
this
really
is meant
cool.
to be watched. My kids are dying to open it. And I'm like, I don't know if I can. Like, I kind of want to keep it, so we'll see.
That would be really cool memorabilia.
Yeah, it's a good one.
So Cyclops is finally cool again. Do we want to talk about Cyclops being
finally
cool?
Again? So, for the people who didn't get it, I think Cyclops is cool again. Certainly, Cyclops was underserved in the live-action films. Like, God damn it.
Yeah.
I really hope they address that in the MCU incarnation, which I really think they will. It doesn't have to be the Wolverine show. It should be the ensemble show. And by the way, to go back for 1 second, you said Bishop lost his haircut. So there's a little tease in episode 3 about what Bishop's really sort of up to. Like, he's basically trying to get back to the future. So he doesn't really have a story arc yet. They tee up something, but it's unclear where that character's going. But in terms of the hairstyles, like, you look at our man Remy the Bow, Gambit, and Aurora, like Storm, they still rocking. Like, Storm's got full mohawk, which is awesome, looks great. And then
so cool.
Gambit's hair's out of control when he's not wearing his costume. So like, they're still bringing back the '80s look, which I do love. So, and it works. It totally fits. So
it's true. Well, we didn't get the '80s in Canada until about 1993. So we appreciate it for even longer.
And Wolverine's still got the crazy
That's a deep
hair too. So
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because you talked about the movies being centralized about Wolverine. I think that likely was in line due to the fact that Hugh Jackman was after X-Men 2000 that was on a rise in Hollywood that I don't think anybody's really been able to capture. What I'm most curious about talking about the larger Marvel thing with this, because there's been hints they're going to do Spider-Man, the animated series, which this is probably blasphemy, but I don't think that show holds up nearly as well. There have been far superior Spider-Man series, in my opinion. And I've mentioned this to you. Spectacular Spider-Man is easily the best Spider-Man cartoon.
It's funny you say that. They're almost doing it. I'm sure the success of X-Men, I mean, it's got 100% Rotten Tomatoes, but if the numbers back it up, again, I personally hope the show continues forever. It's a weird thing to say about creative art, but I do, in this case, I want it to happen as long as the storytellers are there. And I think they will be. I think there's endless inspiration the show offers. But about the Spider-Man, the 90s Spider-Man, it's funny because you look at the Hasbro toy lines, they released all these cool sets in like VHS-style boxes of that 90s Spidey. So I'm like, they almost went out of order for that because they already have the merch out there. But I do think that makes sense, especially if this X-Men show does delve into crossovers and cameos, because there was the infamous crossover in the 90s between the two shows. I'd like to see...
All four of them had, like, they all did. Eventually, they did Secret Wars.
I remember Iron Man animated. I remember Silver Surfer had a show,
Fantastic
right?
Four. They all wound up crossing over. It was essentially the end of Spider-Man was Secret Wars, where you had Captain America. I think you had 2 of the Fantastic Four. I know Reed was there for sure, and they were fighting like Victor. Everybody was there. Yeah, Captain America, and then I think Beast from the X-Men. It was awesome. Like it was the actual full expanded universe of Marvel as opposed to the only characters we have rights for.
Right,
it was that era where everybody was being sold off.
Yeah. Pre-Toy Biz bankruptcy or whatever it was.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. Yeah, I infamously remember like the Logan, or I keep saying Logan, Wolverine interacting with Spider-Man in the show, in the streets there. But good question. I don't know about that. But to go back to Cyclops for a second, yes. I mean, if you read the comics, like comics to me hit like in the 90s it peaked and it died out real quickly. It made to late 90s and it fell off. The sales fell off. Interest fell off. The characters got weird. They took some strange choices with the books to try to make it edgy, and nothing worked. But then, like the mid-aughts, it got awesome again when they kind of reset everything and had Joss Whedon was going to do Astonishing X-Men, but before that, you had like Messiah Complex, which kind of like all the mutants right after House of M sort of reset it all, right? No more mutants, whatever.
Yep.
And then Messiah Complex had this always cool spin-off series. You had like Bishop and Cable doing their things with the baby, right, with Hope. And then you had X-Men and X-Men. Cyclops secretly started the new X-Force, which was like this lethal team. That's when Cyclops was peak badass, because he's like, look, we've been following the rules this whole time, but sometimes there's some evil people out there, and we got to take them the out. And he put on Wolverine, X-23, Archangel. He put together this badass team to go out there and take out these anti-mutant haters, right? And I was like, oh, man, this is nuts. And then you see, and that's like dark Scott Summers on the side hiding from Emma Frost somehow because he's
that's the
genius.
X mask, isn't it? Like he had the X mask over his face.
I think
was that not in that era?
I'm trying to think when he did that. No, not necessarily in this. He does bring that at that point, but at the same time that you get to see more traditional, cool, very sort of clean, polished traditional X-Men in the Joss Whedon's Astonishing X-Men run, and yeah, another version of a badass Cyclops there, with a smaller team, very focused storytelling. And so, like, Cyclops was badass in the comics, and, I've always loved that character. And in the films, I was always upset that James Marsden never got more screen time because he's a superstar as well. And, they kind of gave him they gave him 2 out of 3 notes in the movies, unfortunately. And he could have, now, certainly looking back, he should have had way more screen time. But, we all have problems and quirks with the films because they didn't adapt many of the characters. They infamously did not honor, like, faithfully the diversity of the team and their international origins, right? Like you look at Storm's accent from movie to movie, and Pyro doesn't have an accent; he's just a regular American kid. And Colossus is not even Russian. Like they just every basic thing they screwed up. Like hire a Russian.
He's a big dude
guy.
from Vancouver.
Yeah, and I like that dude in real life, no doubt. But like, come on now, like get a Russian, bodybuilder and just do it. Like that's what it's so. Simple.
Who could play him now is the guy from Creed 2. The guy who played Victor Drago.
Yeah.
Because I think he's in Fallout. Or no, he's in Borderlands. He's the guy in the wearing the mask in Borderlands. He also had like no hand or the laser hand.
He was in Shang-Chi as that dude. Yeah. He also something recently I saw him in too. He had a kind of a secondary role too. But, anyways, so the movie screwed up all of that, and then even Gambit, the Raging Cajun wasn't even Cajun in X-Men Origins of Wolverine. Like every simple thing that you and I could just sit there and be like, no, do this, and there was nobody in that production that could do that. So that's endlessly infuriating. But anyways, that's all. We're derailing from the point. Cyclops is incredibly badass in the first 2 episodes. They change up visually how his powers work. His concussive optic blasts are now actually concussive, and he can physically move himself across the landscape during a battle and land from a free fall using his optic blast. It's very visually appealing, and it makes him far more powerful than he was in the original show. Although in the very first episodes of the original animated series, he's like single-handedly taking out Sentinels by himself with that blast. So he was always powerful, but now he's a little more badass and tactical, which he always should have been. So very cool.
So one last thing I wanted to mention before we jump onto Roadhouse, which is I find this such an interesting time for this to come out. Obviously, animation takes quite a while. Look at the gap between Invincible's seasons.
Yeah.
Is this the worst time for this to come out, or is this the best time given how we don't have the MCU's X-Men yet?
Best.
You think it's the best time? Okay.
I think they held it off intentionally because they know, look, take it back 2 layers here. both the MCU and DCU are in a complete reset phase. MCU hit all times low during COVID. Ever since Phase 4, outside of you and I, we love Shang-Chi, but everything else has been mediocre at best to terrible at worst. The Disney Plus experiment failed. They didn't get the numbers they wanted. It was a growth strategy that didn't actually hit growth, and now they're stuck with the shows that nobody's watching, that would be instantly canceled if they were on cable network TV, right? Pre-investments. The thing they're holding a hope for now is, like, funny enough, all the Fox assets. So the most successful MCU movie since Endgame is going to be Deadpool? Like, what? Like, how do they screw that up, right? And what is Deadpool going to do? It's going to introduce us to
Spider-Man No Way Home.
Yeah, if you want to count a Sony gimmick co-production, which now there is also screwing up future Spider-Man plans, and also holding the hands or tying the hands behind their back to do any other Sony production, because now they're in this weird contract issue about what Spider-Man they can't or cannot use, and so they're screwed up. So certainly, take Spider-Verse out of it, and Sony's screwing up everything, and you have No Way Home, which on its own, not even a great story, but awesome for us fans who love Garfield and this and that. But on its own as a Spider-Man story, not exactly awesome. We love the idea of seeing these characters back, but was that movie great? No, and now what they're doing, they're reportedly trying to make a Spider-Man 4, which is the same thing, and they want to bring back Tobey and Andrew again. It's like, no. Make a Spider-Man movie. Make 3. Like, it doesn't matter. But that's all besides the point. The reason it's important now is because the reset of the MCU and the Secret Wars going forward, it's heavily, heavily going to lean on the X-Men and the Fantastic Four. Mainly the X-Men. This is their most valuable IP from a storytelling standpoint, certainly on live action, but more importantly from a licensing and merch standpoint. So that is the business Disney is in. And all these secondary characters that they were hoping to rebuild the Avengers with do not sell. They just don't. They don't sell books. They don't sell movies. They don't get viewers. Like, you put a biggest star in the world to have him play another version of Moon Knight. It's just not going to be a banger show. So it's like, it just doesn't work. But you throw out Wolverine and Storm, now you got something different, right? You put Gambit and Rogue in something. Oh wow, I haven't seen that before. So this is the future. So have the series come out now in an era when they have cut back substantially on investing and purchasing and building content for Disney Plus. When they have a very small scope of Marvel programming coming to Disney Plus this year. What's the other one? Agatha, and then is that it?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
We had Echo and Agatha. Yeah. Like, who the hell cares? How did either of these characters get shows? Like a spinoff of a show Hawkeye and a spinoff of WandaVision. It's like, no, people want Wanda and Vision. Where's that show? Like, it's just nonsense. Or after Hawkeye, why didn't we get the Kate Bishop show? Why are we doing Echo? You know what I mean? That being said, I actually kind of like the Echo character, and I love Fisk and all that kind of stuff. But besides the point, this is like we're going into C-tier programming when we have every single character in the Marvel library to play with, minus Sony, right? It's absurd. It's so absurd. So anyways, this tees up positivity for the platform. It fills a gap and nothing else there. It fills their merchandise and license marketing windows. They have big slots to fill this stuff up, which they need. They have to do something on social media right now. There's nothing else to promote. And it tees up their biggest project of the year for the whole company, which is Deadpool and Wolverine, which is the real introduction of the X-Men, or versions of the X-Men, into the MCU, which is going to lead to Secret Wars, which is going to lead to X-Men eventually. So, I think timing is great because it literally creates excitement. We are all enthused. This is back. LeBron James is tweeting how much he loves this show. Everyone's going to be watching and looking when Deadpool and Wolverine comes out, because we're going to see Wolverine, this version of this Wolverine almost on the big screen, wearing the yellow and blue, and it's Hugh Jackman again. We're going back to the 90s and 2000s, and this is the best way to kind of tee that up, because it's all positive. It's all positivity for the brand, right? So,
does Hugh Jackman have small feet, though? Because given giant X-Men, Jim Lee famously couldn't draw feet. Do we know if Hugh Jackman has just teeny tiny feet?
Yeah. I don't know. I don't remember looking at Jackman's feet every time I meet him, but I'll keep that in mind next time.
You have a better chance than I do. All right. There is no... Well, I guess you use feet to kick, so then maybe there's a segue in there somewhere. So that wraps up our conversation on X-Men 97. It's on Disney Plus, dropping every Wednesday? Is it Wednesday? I think so. Yeah, Wednesdays. So episode 3 for Disney Plus viewers will drop. If you're listening to this day of release in a couple days, you can look forward to that there. Moving on to the newest film on Amazon Prime, Roadhouse.
Before we start, do you have insurance?
What?
Your coverage good? Like, you have dental? Oh, haha.
Is there a hospital nearby? Is it like too far?
About like 25 minutes, I'd say.
All right. A remake of a film that some people think is great, but sorry, it's not, comes to Prime Video. I saw your tweet about this, and I watched it last night. I'm going to say something minimal, and then I'm going to let you go, which is, it's a movie.
It's a movie. It's not like a movie like Rebel Moon is a movie. This is a movie. Like, okay. Is this your grand opening to me sharing my thoughts? Yeah.
Fine. All right. No, okay, I'll go. All right. I will say a couple things. I was quite frankly very disappointed. I had very high expectations for this. I'm
Very
a
high
big Doug Liman.
From what? To the 60% on Rotten Tomatoes? What are you going off on?
I'm quite a fan of Doug Liman. I think he's made some very well executed action films. Edge of Tomorrow. He created the Bourne film universe. American Made I really enjoyed. Anyway, and Mr. and Mrs. Smith held Jumper. They made a TV show based on Mr. and Mrs. Smith, which is very good, by the way. I highly recommend.
Doug Liman made the show based off Jumper. It's called Impulse, and it was shot in my backyard, our backyard. So
there you go.
Love Doug Liman.
And so that alone with Jake Gyllenhaal, I was intrigued because of course I've seen the original Roadhouse. It's a bad movie.
It's very of its time. Patrick Swayze weirdness. It totally like back in the 90s when I watched that. I'm like, cool, whatever. You know what I mean? Which is
him and Sam Elliott.
Yes.
Okay, but here's the thing.
Sorry, go ahead.
That guy will always be beautiful. Yes. Like if they made Uncharted somehow in 1985, he would have been Sully.
Default stash. He's got it all.
It's perfect. And so I think Jake Gyllenhaal gives a very compelling performance as this broken human being. Surprisingly, the trauma they give him, the post-traumatic stress, for me felt very reminiscent of the first Lethal Weapon, another 80s franchise. And I enjoyed that aspect. Everything else of this movie feels like an early 2000s film, and that really disappointed me. Conor McGregor was so bad, and not in a good way. I saw this comparison online today, and it is 1,000% accurate. I have not seen a performance like this since The Room with Tommy Wiseau. He is so bad. And yes, of course, he is a belt-winning UFC champion. He has no charisma. It's just, look, I'm Conor McGregor. And outside of that, I found this movie boring. And that to me was the ultimate. My kids were asleep. Nalina was on nights. I finished watching the hockey game. I'm like, I'm going to watch Roadhouse. Okay. 40 minutes in, I went, I've got an hour and a half left of this.
Oh, wow. I wasn't bored at all. I agree with you and Conor McGregor, though. Like, I will say this, though. He does capture the screen well, because he's got this obviously the craziest costumes. His introductory scene, he's walking around naked, and he walks in the most goofy, cartoonish way. He is the cartoon primary antagonist, right? This, like, ultimate henchman. And I agree, his acting is weird when he's trying to get close to someone and deliver a line. I feel like it's probably all ADR, because it's very polished and weird, and it's always one tone, you know what I mean? But it kind of worked enough where I'm like, this guy's insane and dangerous, and I really want him to get his ass beat by our man Dalton here, Jake Gyllenhaal's character. So that was effective enough, but it was you're right. Jake's character is interesting because he's a mix of like kind of weird and cocky, but when it comes to dealing with a potential conflict, which he's generally trying to avoid because he's over it. He's very like overly polite to everyone, which I like that juxtaposition. I like how it plays. And I like knowing that he's like this coiled spring that he's just, as soon as he crosses that line, he's going to release and he's confidently going to dominate every single situation. I like having that kind of anti-hero in a sort of on your side. You're just waiting for that moment. He's going to snap. And then boom, you know the bad guys are going to be put into the hospital. So there's something weirdly satisfying in this type of movie, and that is a throwback to those kind of 80s style movies a little bit, and the 90s style actioners. It was a little, overall, from the villains to the storytelling to the meta layer of him meeting this girl, and them talking about this being a modern western, and Dalton, is he a hero? Is he a villain? Is he both? Is he neither? It's all over the top, but it kind of works for what it's trying to do, and it also meshes into the action scenes, which we should talk about. There's a little bit of controversy about there being CG elements of it, but
I noticed distinctly something that was just like something's off.
one of my favorite action stars, Scott Adkins, actually called that out on Twitter over the weekend. He loved he generally liked Jake Gyllenhaal getting in shape. He liked the fights, but he was really down on the CG scenes. But take that part of it out. There was some cool cinematography in some of the fights and how they used the environment. Like they broke a lot of those candy-made glass bottles, like billions of them in this bar. But there's a lot of brutal fights, and you combine that with some over-the-top set pieces that involve boats or buildings falling apart, and it's pretty well done. And the main characters, like, they can have the dramatic moments when they need to between the girl and Dalton or his potential love interest in this film, and then you throw in the over-the-top cops and the over-the-top villains, and it's like, you know, it struggles to find a fine line there, but to me it's enjoyable enough. To me it's like, you know, back before Blockbuster closed, this is the perfect rental I'd have in the weekend, or the modern era. This is a perfect action movie for me to stream at home, and I do think some of those action scenes would have played well on the big screen. I probably not would have bought a ticket as a consumer, and it would have bombed. But visually, I understand why Doug Liman wanted to have it on the big screen, even though financially that probably would not make sense. But yeah, I do recommend it. I mean, I think Amazon is the home of modern action. I think this fits that mold, and I would recommend watching this film if you are at all interested in the original Roadhouse. But even if you're not, it's just a modern action film with a couple notable actors in it. So. Yeah, it's your totally fine 6 point whatever out of 10 action movie that has its ups and downs, but you know, for a streaming film, I think it's a pretty good hit. So
I think that's fair. That's something that it was one of the things I went, okay, this looks way better than your typical streaming action movie. Whether that's they shot in locations because they were actually in Florida for production, or Georgia. In terms of
it's a simple setup. It's one main environment. There's like a boat sequence, and everything else is in this place with a couple little side scenes here, in like the bookstore, which is again a very small closed set almost. It's a couple little shops in the corner, right? So
I think
simple production from an environmental standpoint.
Mm-hmm, that's true. One thing that I found frustrating was particularly in so Jake Gyllenhaal, he's done action. We've seen him do a lot of other stuff, whether that's specifically just boxing in Southpaw, which is a film I really enjoyed, and then moving into, like, what's the one where he's a cop?
Or he just end of the line or whatever, or what's it called? End of Watch.
End of Watch. Anyways,
that's the cop movie with Michael Pena, David Ayer film.
Yeah. What I found really interesting was Doug Liman in particular was criticized quite heavily for Bourne Identity's like into close cinematography with lots of cuts, which then Paul Greengrass took really hard did significantly worse, I would argue, for the other two. But for this, it was more so the actual staging of the fights. I felt like they were overly edited, and clearly, like, there's a lot of, I think some of the humor that is played within the fighting is quite entertaining, as you mentioned, like Jake Gyllenhaal being that, like, okay, what's gonna break the clip the listeners would have heard, or the first real altercation he has with the bikers at the bar. But a lot of this just feels underserved. One thing, and I had a conversation with other people about this, but I found it weird, which was Jake Gyllenhaal is 43 years old, and his love interest in this film is 27. So, like, for me, it didn't work in terms of a romantic relationship. I would have much preferred, similar to the relationship he has with the girl at the bookstore, to have, like, something be much more, not paternal, because that would be weirder, but, like, as this, like, broken older brother.
Yeah,
because I didn't buy a sibling of, like, he is like that cowboy brought up in the Westerns, like, the metaphor that I would have for this is Reacher with a budget, but less interesting action. Because it takes him in that, like, particularly with what he does, he goes into town and he solves all the problems. But this guy, being an MMA fighter, goes into that, like, to me, this felt like, here, I'm going to continue this metaphor. If the Baywatch movie with The Rock and Reacher had a baby, this is the product, and it's not a great one. Because they do these ridiculous things that, like, you have no basis for with the background of that character. Jack Reacher is a trained serviceman, where, what is it, Ellard Dalton? What's his first name? Elwood Dalton, he's just a mixed martial arts fighter. So when you get into the boat chases and whatnot, it's like you're pushing my believability of this guy.
I see.
And so I found myself less interested because and I think this is probably on my side, and I accept that, which is it leans into that early 90s, 80s craziness, but with modern sensibilities, I don't think it works.
You know what? I see that, certainly with the boat sequence, because that was like, he's dodging whatever. But if you remember what actually happens there, what's interesting about this film is like how reluctant he is, to get into fights in general. Like he trains up basically 2 apprentices in this bar, and most of the part just lets stuff happen. He's unfazed until, again, someone crosses the first line, where they're going to hit an innocent or put a child in danger or something like that. Then he'll step forward, and then when you take the first swing, then he'll finish the fight, right? That's kind of cool. But you'll notice in every single scene, he avoids using the knife. He never uses the gun. In fact, he throws it away every single time. He gives the gun back to someone after taking the ammo. And another guy meets a water-based local, and he just throws the shotgun in the water. It's like he doesn't even try, you know what I mean? And it's very like bar brawl, even in those little close encounters fights. So it kind of worked for me. And the other part of it is like if you look at why he's a disgraced MMA fighter, he always crossed that line. So he's an MMA fighter, he's elitely trained, one of the best fighters, fist to fist. This is not wrestling, this is real MMA fighting. Best in the world, killed a dude doing this. And he's also having this like penance streak where he almost enjoys and can accept pain. He has an ungodly pain threshold. So you combine all of that plus this weird extreme motivation in which nothing will stop until he dies sort of thing. I kind of see that. So that part of it kind of worked for me. Of course, the action set piece of the boat doing this and flying into the I mean, that's the lineman over the top craziness to make it a blockbuster for a streaming sort of situation. But in terms of what happens in the action scenes, and even the final fight with Connor, when there's some sharp objects involved, it's all very like in line with what I think a crazed world-class MMA fighter who will do anything to stop someone could do. You know what I mean?
He gets stabbed
Again,
in the same
no swords,
spot,
no
I think,
knives.
3 times.
That I did think that was
Or at
weird.
least-
The getting stabbed again there, yeah. But whatever, as long as his muscles kind of work, he'll just keep going. Whatever, he enjoys that pain, right?
Well, and the thing that I brought up Lethal Weapon earlier, and it was one of the elements I appreciated the most was, as I mentioned, Jake Gyllenhaal's character of Dalton, which is like his like emotionally broken after killing his friend in the ring. We're in full spoilers. I think I said that earlier, but yes, the whole thing's going to be spoilers. And that, like, when we see him at the very beginning, like he's contemplating killing himself on the train tracks, right? Like that full-blown PTSD level depression is in there, which would to some degree explain why he takes pain. And I just think if this script had been rewritten again or gone through maybe like punch-ups where we really get to play, it sounds diminutive of what I mean, but actually exploring that to some level, like we get his dream sequence and boats give you weird reactions, and I like the relationship that he has with Jessica Williams. I feel like she's not in the movie nearly enough, but playing with that dynamic of like this broken person still wanting to do the right thing. And I agree with you, he's clearly not a hero because he just kills a bunch of people and has like to clinical precision levels. Like the one guy, he just breaks his trachea and throws him in a pool.
In the third act he does. In the first 2 acts he's intentionally not in that. So much so he even asks characters if they have insurance, and he takes him to the hospital. Like he's very much not trying to kill people until they captured or put a girl in the hospital. Then no holds barred. These guys have to go. You know what I mean? So, and that honestly at that point as an audience member, I'm like, yeah, these guys are just not stopping, and now they're targeting innocent children. Game over, man. It's time to go. And he does. So I appreciate that development to that point. And again, he doesn't go in there with a shotgun. He goes in there as himself, right? And someone tries to stand up to him and he puts him out. So I'm like, I do like that continued restraint throughout. You know what I mean? So you in a weird way, like the Conor McGregor character, what's his name? Knox? What do they call him? I forget. But
Knox.
I think he has Knox tattooed. Yeah, I think that's what it is. I almost thought like Knox had a weird respect for him because they both like they recognize each other, are like crazy over the top, won't stop. I almost thought Knox was if not going to team up with him in a way, just not going to take him out. Like, I almost thought Knox was going to, like, the two of them were kind of like, be like, okay, we're both that kind of character, and like they were going to part ways or team up in a weird way. But obviously that didn't happen. That became a very traditional fight. But I thought that was going to be a bit of a twist in the film. Because after the first confrontation, the way they split up and talk about each other, it just felt kind of like it was leading towards something that was untraditional, but it ended up being just what it is, you know? So.
Like I found their first fight more interesting because of the way it plays throughout the bar. Like there's more humor in the final fight. Like there's the Jake Gyllenhaal's talked about it where he hits his head on the piano. He's like, I think this is out of tune. Like I thought that was quite funny, but I don't know. In a world of John Wick 4s, and I know that shouldn't be the bar for everybody. It's not fair, but at the end of the day, hire them. If you want 8711 or North, I don't really care. Like I think.
Do you want that though? That's gun fu.
No,
that's elite
it's
assassins
not gung fu.
Doing crazy martial arts.
So it's not gung fu. I'm using kind of 87 as like a blanket statement. What I should say just in general is in a world of John Wicks, and I mean when we play video games together, so you've heard me talk about this endless times, which is something like Warrior. With the stunt coordination from Brett Chan, who also worked on a lot of the Netflix Marvel stuff. Like, my expectation, if your product is action, and Roadhouse is famous for just roundhouse kicks in jeans, and then so, like, you're pitching this, okay, it's Jake Gyllenhaal, who's done action, we're going to see some more modern action. It's in preparation and on concept. And to me, outside of stabbings being in unique places and the clinical nature to which they were done, it just kind of was like, and then we got some weird first person shots where somebody's being punched in the face.
Yeah,
like it was just, I don't know.
Film.
Yeah, that for me
that was strange.
Underwhelming.
Yeah. I actually had no issue with the action. I thought like it's MMA style in a bar. It's bar brawl MMA, and to me, it's this is what that is. And then he goes in the street, and it's very like not jujitsu, but like a little bit of that actually. But whatever, I forget. It escapes me what I'm thinking of, but it's not supposed to be polished. Like even Warrior to some extent is very like it's choreoed in a pretty clean way, and yes, it can be brutal, but the cinematography and the choreo is very clean.
That's
and
my problem. The
extremely
cinematography
clean.
for this.
This is not meant to be.
That was not.
Yeah, to me, it's meant to be like this is a crazy bar, and you can see that because like again, there's the first person stuff, which is weird, and I described it in Podcast X as an adjustment to even watch because it's very like jarring almost how it transitions. But there are other scenes where the camera follows the movement, so a body falls to the table, the head hits the thing. It's like the camera's moving with them and zooming in with them, and it's like, oh, okay, they're trying to do a different kind of dynamicism with this like bar brawl, and it's okay, whatever. But the actual fight choreo, and when Jake is disarming someone or breaking a thing, that's effective. I was totally in for that. It is what it is. It felt MMA. It felt like a bar brawl. And the first person stuff and some of the, again, there's a bit of CG stuff and a few over the top action sequences that involve the environment or boats. That, that's over the top. But I wasn't disappointed by that. I was disappointed because some of the writing and acting was kind of like, you know what I mean? And again, some of the things I thought would have been interesting twists on characters kind of felt like they are what they are. It's very telegraphed. You can kind of once you see the beginning of the second act, you know kind of the end point of every character. I feel like, you know what I mean. So I was hoping for a little more interesting nature there in the end, but in the end, it did feel like for better or worse, a very traditional, again, 80s 90s actioner. So the way it ends and with this kind of debatable anti-hero, neither hero nor villain, but there to stop the evil, I suppose. So.
Yeah, at the end of the day, as I said in the beginning, it's a movie.
Go watch it if you have Prime. Come on.
Yeah, it's on Prime. Honestly, it's a streamer movie. There are far worse streaming movies that I've seen that I wouldn't have talked on the show, which is fine.
I'll say this. It's better than what I've seen. I feel like 3 of the last 4 movies I saw leading up to this were worse. So, like, I feel like, there's a lot of bad product we're getting in theaters. Go look at, I saw, like, Argyle and Madam Web were, to me, like, terrible. Before that, I watched Rebel Moon on Netflix. I'm like, oh, my God. These are just god-awful products. I cannot believe people are paying money for this. And then I got this.
I had more fun with Argyle than I did with this.
I couldn't handle Argyle. There was a couple moments in it, but I thought that was just absolutely trash film. But which is a shame because I love these characters, I love that director, I love that universe they're leading towards. But oh my God, this movie felt like it's not bad. It's not great, but it's totally watch. This one I can say, yeah, you can watch this at home and be satisfied enough with it, right? Those other ones, hells no. So
That's fair.
in the modern era, maybe this is great. We'll see.
2024 is not looking up.
And here's you
Fortunately,
talking down on Kung Fu Panda 4. So it's like you're not looking good these days in theaters. So, and I haven't seen Ghostbusters, but I have a feeling you didn't love that one either.
I didn't. Okay, before getting into Ghostbusters, I know you heard I think Kofi and Ben talk about it. It is more Ghostbusters, but it fails where Afterlife succeeded for me, and then it's just kind of, it's fine. That's for me. Everything's a movie.
Afterlife
That's the way I feel it this week.
I tell you what, very quickly, and I got to sign out. But like Afterlife, I like the intrigue of like unraveling these kids' characters and discovering their ancestry and what the mystery of that's about to unfold. And the other part of it that worked for me is the heart. Like I was genuinely emotional, like in the third act there. So, so I kind of like that kind of modern take on taking it seriously. You know what I mean? But I don't know what to expect from Frozen Empire. So I will listen or watch your podcast after you share your thoughts. Very curious.
I've been waiting 40 years for this.
They called themselves Ghostbusters.
This is full spoilers for Ghostbusters Afterlife. I know that's typically not the convention, but given the uniqueness of this episode and making sure I wanted to include Rob in the two discussions that we already had, unfortunately, he's not a part of this discussion, but that's all right. I'm going to give full spoilers into what I thought about Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. As mentioned, I quite enjoyed Ghostbusters Afterlife. It kind of was like The Force Awakens for the Ghostbusters franchise, which I do like the first one. I'm not a fan of Ghostbusters 2. And because of that, I think Ghostbusters is in a really unique place where the franchise needs to grow and lean into a new direction. The benefit of adding a new cast is it allows for the opportunity to do that. But unfortunately, and this is going to be completely controversial, and I'm aware, while Force Awakens, similar to Ghostbusters Afterlife, was a significant revisit and a retelling of story we had been told already, and it received criticism, both films, for that, I was really hoping Ghostbusters Frozen Empire was going to be the last Jedi for the Ghostbusters universe, and unfortunately it's not. And because of that, it just, to me, felt like more Ghostbusters. I really did like how they did lean into some stories, particularly with, my brain is mush, what is her name? Her name is Phoebe, with the Spengler family and the evolution of the Ghostbusters franchise within the films, having Paul Rudd's character of Gary, and then Trevor, Phoebe, and Callie taking on the Spengler legacy, and the other Ghostbusters not being involved at all, except for Ernie Hudson's character. My brain is mush, and I don't want to get any of the names wrong. Winston. And in doing so, it feels kind of like this film was driving around with the brakes on, where we sort of get going, but at the same time, it's interesting talking about all three of these products in this episode of the podcast, which is, I think the film ultimately failed on the script level, where there's a lot of really interesting ideas, but unfortunately the way that they're presented, and in wanting to really keep the elderly cast a part of the story, they honestly just felt like, we're here, but we're not actually going to do anything interesting with them. There are elements teased, such as Ray not wanting to retire from being a Ghostbuster. This is what he wants to do with his golden years. And you sort of get a back and forth between him and Winston about that. Bill Murray shows up as honestly a glorified cameo, being a part of what they're doing. Not really. He just sort of shows up when the plot requires him to be in the movie for this to feel more connected to the original. I quite honestly probably would have enjoyed this more if Winston was around in the background, but allowing the Ghostbusters to be their own and really overcome this challenge. Now, to some degree, they do, but they also have the ability of leaning on the old Ghostbusters, and in having this new team be their own, it would be nice for them to completely solve the issue without having them in the film, if the old and original Ghostbusters were truly retired. I think the aspect of having Phoebe be double-crossed by a ghost that the way that I interpreted it was a romantic level, which to my knowledge would be the first presentation of a character in Ghostbusters, at least of the main cast, being a LGBTQ plus twin spirit member. And I really like that. Phoebe is clearly the focus of this franchise, and as a lead, I really think she works. McKenna Grace is a fantastic representation of that character, really bringing forth the respect and the value in the Ghostbusters ideology and wanting to live up to the idea of her grandfather, somebody who she never really got to know. And that causes friction between her and her birth mother and Gary, who's in this interesting aspect of not knowing whether he wants to be a stepdad or not. That stuff was fun. However, when somebody like Patton Oswalt shows up just to be King Exposition and explain this whole new backstory, this was an aspect of the film that I really struggled with, which was, I'm really happy you're doing new lore, but there is so much that the way that it's presented, it just feels like he's Mr. Exposition, which is unfortunate because I love Patton Oswalt. He's typically really great at this stuff, building in lore into a universe. His famous speech that he had when he was using the filibuster to hold up that scene in Parks and Recreation, but then also having Kamal Nanjiani be a character who shows up in the beginning to essentially set the plot up forward, gets kind of lost for 2/3 of the film until the very end, where it finds out he's from this ancient society that was in charge of keeping this demon at bay. It would have been much more interesting to me if they were able to integrate him more succinctly through the story. And as mentioned, that comes down to script problems. This movie is trying to serve too many masters, and unfortunately, because of that, it's more underwhelming than Afterlife. Yes, the criticism of going back to Zool is a valid one. However, I enjoyed the experience of getting to see new characters, learn about the world of the Ghostbusters, and coming into their own, quite frankly, in the original, or in Afterlife, where we have Phoebe come up with a solution, and she does do so in this. Having the other Ghostbusters there at the very end when they're ultimately fighting, what is the main villain's name? My brain is mush. What is it say his character called? Garaka, that's what it was. Is a really compelling and interesting villain in design, but outside of him just being mad at the king, he doesn't really get developed. Not to say that you have to, because famously most of the Ghostbusters antagonists and villains are not overly well fleshed out. He looks really cool. A frozen New York in the summer is a really great aesthetic and adds something that we hadn't seen from the Ghostbusters franchise, expanding the world positively, allowing the Ghostbusters organization to continue to expand. However, with this film being so strict on wanting to stick to the original films, having Walter Peck back was fun. William Atherton was really interesting to play as that character. I'm a little disappointed nobody said this man has no dick, which is famously the line that people were yelling at him when he was in the original film. But a lot of the elements of this movie do feel reminiscent also of Ghostbusters. So that element that I think received fair criticism before of Afterlife is still present here in this movie, which is why I found this film to be a weird stepchild of continuing to expand the Ghostbusters universe, things I like with new characters, but because of wanting to feel so beholden to the people who love the original, which is why they keep making these films in this franchise. If you're unaware, that adjusted for box office, Ghostbusters is one of Columbia's / Sony's most successful films of all time. That's why they've continued to revisit this, whether it be with the 2016 film, Afterlife, and now Frozen Empire. Now, with all that being said, it is still a franchise that I would like to revisit if we can just focus on Spengler Family 2.0. The dynamic with the four of them is the best aspect of the film. I think Trevor, played by Finn Wolfhard, is certainly the least developed. He wants to continue this narrative that he did have from Afterlife, which was growing up, becoming a man, and his relationship with Carrie Coon could have been really interesting. However, we don't really get to see that dynamic played up with, other than he wants to drive and he has to deal with Slimer, who doesn't actually really serve the narrative at all, other than just having Slimer be in it. And the conclusion to that is, well, at the end of the film, you are allowed to drive. So if we had had more focus on the new characters from Afterlife, I think that plot point and character growth would have actually felt earned, as opposed to, this is a fun way to wrap up the ending. Look, we're surrounded by people like we were in Ghostbusters 1 and 2. And also, if we are going to play up the aspect of the historical relationship the Ghostbusters have with the city that is mentioned in the film, I would have really liked to see that be a part of the story. Do Spangler 2.0 Ghostbusters feel beholden or failure to the bar that the Ghostbusters had set in Ghostbusters 1 and 2? It was a conversation around Afterlife that Ghostbusters 2 may not have happened. Clearly, that narrative is no longer true because if you have seen this film, you know that they show footage from Ghostbusters 2 and really play up the media of the Ghostbusters brand within the Ghostbusters movie universe, which I really appreciated. And I think that would have been a really interesting thing to play up because of the conflict that Phoebe has with her family about them only being Ghostbusters because she got them involved. That conflict is kind of sidestepped to the larger issue, which I understand, of course, if the world is at stake, that's going to be the more important thing. But to explore the human dynamic and relationships in the movie being the center of it would have been more compelling as opposed to blowing this out like the cartoon universe. They've talked about that, comparing it to the real or the extreme Ghostbusters. And to some degree, it does kind of feel like that because it is chaotic and there's a lot of stuff that are probably going to do really well as merch. The film being kind of a hot mess for me, it works, it's fun, it's entertaining, it introduces some new ideas, but ultimately it's just more Ghostbusters. And as I said with Rob, it's a movie. Now, I would personally say out of the two films I saw this week, I enjoyed Ghostbusters more. I would totally be willing to see a sequel, as I've said, focusing on the new cast and letting the other cast kind of retire out. Whether we get to explore the potential relationship that Callie Spengler has with Janine, that's something that they teased in the first one that we don't talk about at all here. I would really like to see that, but it wasn't discussed in this one. We get a lot of fun stuff. Podcast is back. I don't know really why he's in the movie outside of just having to be a character that Phoebe is familiar with. It's fine. And if I were to wrap this up, going to rank all the Ghostbusters, starting from the fourth, that for me is easily Ghostbusters 2. Third, I would say is Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. And then second would be Ghostbusters Afterlife. And then number one, of course, would be Ghostbusters, the original. That's how I would rank all four of them. Let me know how you would rank them. You can comment on any of the social media platforms. It's posted there. That's my brief yet compact review of Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. Let's jump into the outro and we can see your answers to the most recent question of the week. Thank you so much for listening to the Film Realist podcast. Next week's episode will be a review. I'm actually so glad you're here for this. Of Godzilla X Kong New Empire. Oh boy. Before I let Rob go and we get into the question of the week, I wanted to get Rob's answer, which was, this was in last week's episode, which was Invincible Season 2, Part 2 debut, and The Gentleman television series. What was the first comic book or graphic novel you read? Do you remember?
Good question. Honestly, it's X-Men comics. Those are the ones like when I was like in the very, very early 90s, probably when the show first started, maybe even before. I remember like being sick at home and Mom came home with like an X-Men book and it was like just life-changing. I remember getting a few from my cousin and someone at school gave me a stack of comics that got like a garage sale. And like a third of them were X-Men comics. The other ones were like Indie Lions, which is cool. And like a Spawn book or something. So like, yeah, I think X-Men is the one I actually like gravitated towards and started collecting. And that, you know, like the TV show, it really defined my interest and eventually my career growing up. So that's the one for me.
Thanks, Rob, for your answer. All right, we also have Dylan Pollock. Here's the answer for nobody that's hopefully for somebody. I know the first comic book I read was A Justice League of America, where the bad guy was Despero, and it gave his origin. Found that tattered comic book in an antique store. Not the first, but one of the first I can remember is A Green Lantern versus Aliens, which I found so cool at the time. And also, I am the only one who feels this way, but I love ads in random old comic books. That's true. Those were super fun. I appreciate those as well. Until next week, Dylan, thank you. Scotty Cameron wrote in Marvel Age if it was effectively retelling the Stan Lee stories. Oh, okay, cool. Those were really cool. With some modern art and dialogue. James Strecker of Jump on the Bandwagon is here. Oh my goodness. The first comic book I ever read that I can remember was Superman number 77, drawn by Ed McGuinness. It featured Metallo and Toyman as skyscraper-sized BattleBots fighting it out in the streets of Metropolis. I can remember liking the art style of Superman, but hating the look of the rest of it. It didn't feel like the animated series, and the art felt too complicated in my little kid eyes. I remember that kind of turned me off to reading comic books. If they are all like this, I don't know that I'm going to enjoy them. I was very wrong, of course, as the comic book medium is quite often wonderful and unmatched, and I have since read countless amazing stories, but even today I still gravitate toward the artists that have a simplified, almost cartoonish look to them. I think both subconsciously and consciously because of my love for the DC animated series. Stephanie writes in the Archie comics, including Betty and Veronica, and then in a young adulthood, I discovered the Buffy graphic novels. Awesome, thank you. Brian Maneely, other co-host of Jump on the Bandwagon, has also written in here, said something from Marvel. I'm not sure. I'm guessing X-Men. Nice, thank you so much. Scotty Cameron also sent in a massive email, so bear with me. Here we go. To expand on my Spotify answer about the Marvel Age Spider-Man, it was the run released in the mid-2000s to promote Sam Raimi's Spider-Man films by rewriting Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's stories for new and younger readers. Eventually, Marvel replaced Marvel Age with Marvel Adventures and decided to use Marvel Adventures to tell new stories for young readers instead of retelling old ones. I read Marvel Adventures Spider-Man 2. I also read a Batman run that was a collab between DC and Scholastic that served the same purposes as Marvel Adventures and Marvel Age. The Batman comics were a combination of early chapter books with comic books. They featured comic panels. Oh, I just lost where I was. Comic panels between portions of the chapters to help tell the story. Those Batman comics were written by comic book writers such as Dan Sport, who went on to do Amazing Spider-Man and Superior Spider-Man, and Devin Grayson, who went on to write Gotham Knights and Nightwing comics. The art featured from these artists was like John Byrne, who provided art for Chris Claremont's X-Men series, and Rick Burchett, who does a lot of the art for the DCAU tie-in comics. I read the Batman hardcover and the Marvel Age issues when I was really young, so they're not in very good condition. While the Marvel Age Spider-Man and Marvel Adventures Spider-Man trade paperbacks collection I got later while I was still a kid but much older, so they're in better condition. Looking back at these, it makes me wish that major publishers like DC, Marvel, Image, Dark Horse, IDW, Valiant, Dynamite, and Boom Studios would publish more comics aimed to get young readers into comics akin to these, because I found those kinds of endeavors useful into getting me into reading comics. I find it, in many ways, it is more helpful in making comic book readers than making storybooks for children featuring iconic comic book characters, which I read plenty of those growing up too, because it prepares a reader for the format of a comic. That purposeful storytelling featuring iconic comic book characters does it just familiarize people with the characters and nothing more, sort of like novels and the iconic comic book characters or novelizations of popular graphic novels, which I do enjoy reading as well. To promote only those characters and franchise, which I'm all for. However, I would also like to bring the format to young and new readers too. These are the first titles I read: Marvel Age, Spider-Man. That's why it's not my Spotify answer. Then I read Batman comics as discussed. After all, I read Marvel Adventures before diving into mainline comics. Thank you so much, everybody, for your answers. As, of course, you responding to these is one of my favorite parts of the week. The very first comic book that I remember reading was the comic book where Tim Drake became Robin. Now, I have to look up the exact number because I don't actually remember which issue he became Robin in, but it was an old comic of my dad's. So that was the first comic I remember reading, and it is a very beat up issue of that comic in particular. I'm trying to look for the image right now, but I can't find it off the top of my head. If I do, I will tweet it out on social media, or I just posted on social media. As said already, next week's episode of the podcast will be a review of Godzilla x Kong. And I believe that's all. But of course, if you are following on the social media platforms, you will see what else I'm going to be talking about, which I'm fairly certain is just that. But if anything changes, you know where to find me. My name is Kyle Naranya. I am the Film Realist. But by listening to this, I hope you feel you are one as well. Thank you for listening to the podcast, and I will see you next time. After talking about X-Men 97, I thought it would be fun to kind of throw in a post-credit. So if you're really listening to the podcast, you now will know this week's question of the week is not what animated series would you like to get a revival of, because I feel like that's what a lot of people are talking about, but I'm curious what your favorite animated series was growing up. For some of you, that might feel like a softball, but I'm really curious what everybody's favorite show was. It might necessarily not be a superhero show. It could be a different animated series. So I'm looking forward to seeing what that is. Make sure you send it in before Saturday evening, so that way I have a chance to accumulate all your answers. Thanks for listening to the podcast. I'll see you next time.